Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm discussing The Wars of the Roses by Alison Weir. So this book is a little different than what I usually talk about on this channel. This is a pretty straightforward, very detailed history of the Wars of the Roses. You can see it's quite stout, very detailed. So this book is all about the dispute between the houses of Lancaster and York for the throne, all of the circumstances and the usurping that created the possibility of this dispute, and how it eventually leads to the destruction of both houses, allowing for the rise of the Tudors. So this is an area of history I did not have a lot of prior knowledge about going into this book. Everything was a surprise to me, but I'm interested in throwing into my reading some in-depth history, learning a little bit more. And I think as a reader and analyzer of literature in general, this is a good time in history to be familiar with, because it has inspired a lot of writing from Shakespeare to Game of Thrones. It's had kind of an outsized influence on literature. So I found Weir to be a very clear, unbiased, extremely well-sourced historian with this book. It's definitely a good place to get my foundational knowledge that I wanted about the Wars of the Roses. I've got a second book on the shelf that is supposed to get more into like the human side and the intrigue of it, which I'm gonna get to in a few books. But this one is very focused on the facts. Weir often references things as maybe gossip or propaganda, or she always kind of notes when something is an unknown. She's not like editorializing the story. So my purpose for reading this book is a little different than why I read other books, and the way I talk about it is going to be a little different. You know, I'm not talking about language and themes and authorial choice so much, but I'm kind of focused on what the Wars of the Roses is telling us about humanity, like trying to hone in on why this chapter of history is so inspiring to writers, and to look at the kind of patterns that Weir draws our attention to. So let's start with talking about the kind of iconic figure of Margaret of Anjou. So Margaret was the wife and queen of Henry VI of House Lancaster, and she breaks this kind of long tradition of queens not being involved in politics by being very much involved, often essentially ruling England in her husband's name. Because Henry VI, in the best of times, is weak and very much under her influence, and in the worst of times, he's completely incapacitated by his mental health issues. So kind of foreign queen having a lot of influence is of course going to make her unpopular, but Margaret of Anjou was unpopular in England as a rule before she did anything, because she was French. You know, this time period is coming at the end of the 100 Years' War, so there's a very strong anti-French sentiment in England. And it just seems like at every opportunity Margaret has to make a decision, she makes the decision that is going to be the most unpopular with the English people. You know, Weir shows us that she's quite young when she first arrives and kind of takes charge of the English court. She's very stubborn, and she severely lacks knowledge of the English people, the people that she is ruling, to her great detriment. We see her struggle to get the support of the common people. She institutes conscription for the first time, very unpopular. She politically aligns with Scotland and France, who are traditional enemies of England. And we see her bearing a lot of the responsibility for these divisions at court and these warring factions that leads to this conflict. So this idea of factions, this inner circle that kind of belongs to the queen, is a huge point of contention. These people are receiving a lot of benefits based on personal favor and not their merit. And the benefits they're receiving are certainly at the detriment of the people, the finances of the crown in general, and are offensive to the other noblemen that are cut out of that circle. She offends a lot of people and creates a lot of enemies where enemies maybe didn't exist before. And Weir certainly shows us a long pattern of offense towards the Duke of York in particular, like years and years and years of offenses, which certainly leads to everything that happens with the Wars of the Roses. So at the time that these conflicts are starting, the throne had been usurped like 2 generations back. That action created the possibility of another bloodline having a better claim. And it's kind of this openly known but unsaid truth that the Duke of York has a stronger claim by his blood to the throne than Henry VI. But for a large portion of the time period that is considered the Wars of the Roses, everyone, including the Duke of York, is happy to live peacefully and let Henry VI rule unchallenged. It takes a long time before the Duke of York makes an actual claim for the throne. For most of this, he just wants a seat at the table to be in the inner circle in a position of influence, as his birth denotes that he should. But we're seeing Margaret of Anjou kind of unable to see that clearly. She's very paranoid about the Duke of York in particular, the threat that his very birth poses to Henry VI and to her son. And she fears that if she gives him any influence in the court, he's going to use that to take the throne. So she pushes him away, she gives him no in, and she makes an enemy of him. And you certainly wonder what would have happened if she had made the Duke of York a friend, if she had brought him into the fold. Would he have pursued this path? You know, she's kind of a fascinating, flawed, significant figure. It certainly seems she could be brutal and short-sighted, but she is the driving force behind the Lancaster side of this conflict. Everyone is under her orders, which is certainly notable for a woman. So it's no surprise that she in particular inspires depictions. Cersei Lannister is a character that pretty clearly takes inspiration from the story of Margaret. And then we see in her husband, Henry VI, a kind of opposite of Margaret in a lot of ways, though they do seem interestingly very loyal to each other. But yeah, Henry VI really highlights that good men are not necessarily good leaders, that the ability to lead well is not something one can inherit. Seems his father was a strong leader and war strategist, and Henry VI is not. He's just not a good king. He's a poor manager of the government. He financially drains the crown so that it can't self-sustain or even come close to self-sustaining. And he can't control his noblemen, so this is a period of the rule of law crumbling. Under his watch, his wife makes a lot of enemies where he doesn't need to have enemies. And very significantly to the English people, he loses all of the territory England gained over the course of the 100 Years' War with France. He loses everything his father worked for, and he loses it, like, rapidly, like, brutally. He's just in no way a good king, and you can see he gets so many opportunities to show just even a little bit of improvement, like just a little walk in the right direction could have saved him. You know, his kind of incompetence certainly opens the door for his crown to be taken. But it really seems that he wasn't a bad man. The accounts of him are that he's very pious, that he's kind of gentle and docile in his personality. He's very good and loyal to his wife and son. He's not a warmonger. He's not petty. He doesn't seek revenge, even as all of these uprisings and things are happening. But for all that, he lacked a sharpness that he needed. He's too easily influenced by whoever was kind of in control of him at the moment. It's kind of baffling how many obvious and numerous errors that Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou make, to the point where when they get overthrown, when the crown is taken, you're like, I can't believe it hasn't already happened. I can't believe they've been given so many warnings and so many chances to change course. It's like they're simultaneously very paranoid about what the Duke of York represents, what he could do, but they also don't take him seriously enough to act. So something interesting that Weir highlights at different moments in this story, and a big part of why Henry VI was able to keep his throne for so long despite all of the obvious issues, was the mystique of the throne and the religious belief that the people tied to it. So in this time period, the actions of the crown, their victories, their defeats, are viewed as divinely inspired, as determined by God. So Henry VI leading for a period of time after his father led, it's God's will being done. He is God's representative. And we're seeing this as a lens to understand the common people and kind of the extent that it has to go, the extremes we have to get to for them to be okay with the overthrowing of their sovereign, for it to be accepted. So we see for a frustrating length of time, for years in this conflict, the Duke of York and his complaints are not aimed at Henry VI directly, but aimed at his queen and his corrupt advisors around him that are the ones that are really in control and really responsible for all the problems. All the critique, all the ire is following on those key figures around the king, not the king directly. You know, even as the advisors change and the Duke of York and his supporters make demands and things shift a little bit here and there, Henry VI and the Queen kind of always revert to their typical way of running things. They make the same mistakes again and again. I think you certainly wonder, reading about this history, if the reason why the hatred for Margaret was so intense, I mean, there were a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was that it was just a redirection of all the frustration that the people could not aim at the king. It just takes a huge, unfathomable amount of bad for the people, the noblemen who aren't super invested in this conflict, to actually want the king to be deposed. And even when those insanely bad things happen, there are a lot of people who still think that that's a step too far. But Margaret allowing a foreign invader to come in and pillage her own country, that's a pretty good step in that direction. Weir shows us all of these accounts of those maybe subtler attempts at power, of manipulating that religious belief in the throne, the religious belief that God determines the outcome of battles. We see a lot of propaganda being spread by both sides to sway the public. And as the two kings each have sons and heirs, we see those princes being paraded around, something for the people to hope for. All of these attempts to win the hearts of the common people and the noblemen who have not chosen a side. Or, there's a lot of flip-flopping, so maybe to turn some noblemen and their people to their side. That was something that was very interesting. So many people are just totally disloyal. The most loyal person to one side will switch to the other side if the right price is given. With all that effort to be kind of liked and chosen, it really seems like the outcomes are actually determined by whoever has the might of the moment, whoever's built the biggest army and has them in the right place at the right time. We see in this conflict the throne changing hands 3 different times just because the victorious side was there, ready to walk into London unopposed and just take over. Whoever could gain control of London could be king. From a modern viewpoint, there's no mystique there to the crown. It's just military strategy and luck. All the rest is just how the victors tell their stories after the fact. There's a lot in this about myth-making, which I think is definitely something that's interesting to writers. King Edward of House of York never lost a battle, and his victories were so decisive and true that they showed the will of God. That's his story. And we see, very interestingly, Weir gives us kind of the story that was made after the fact by the Tudors, who were trying to place themselves in this history and give context for their own rule. And it's notable how Weir highlights this and debunks quite a bit of it, because the Tudors had their kind of propaganda that uplifted themselves and was certainly not unbiased. In a good amount of the way they tell the story, survives to this day, so it's definitely notable to unpack that. Yeah, the Tudors kind of give themselves a sort of dubious connection to House of Lancaster to kind of legitimize what they end up doing. And the way they tell the story is necessarily anti-York because they don't want to encourage somebody else to do to them what the Yorks did to the Lancasters. The Tudor prerogative, Henry VII's prerogative in telling this story is to paint the Yorks as disruptors of the peace. I thought all of those elements were really interesting, of looking at how Henry VII was telling this story and kind of peeling that back. Because underneath the mythologizing and the ascription of destiny and fate on this story, I think what we're actually seeing is the circumstances and decisions that can make a power vacuum and those who are willing to fill that gap, taking advantage of the opportunities when they arise. Finally, ultimately, what I think makes the Wars of the Roses so fascinating, what makes them so ripe for literary illusion, is just how fruitless it all is, how it shows kind of the shallowness and impermanence of the actions and lives of men, even of kings. You know, for all of their effort, is the royal court of York under King Edward really that different from Henry VI's court? I mean, he also has an unpopular queen. He also has warring factions to deal with. He's got another foreign power stoking unrest for his entire rule. And at the end of the day, both houses fall. They both kind of lose everything because of this conflict. Their legacies end with this war. Neither Henry VI nor Edward see their sons succeed to the throne because their heirs don't live that long. Henry VI's entire house dies with him. They're fully eliminated by the Yorks, and Margaret of Anjou ends up kind of a political refugee in France. And Edward, while he does rule for a significant amount of time and rules quite well, immediately after his death, his own brother murders his heirs and takes the throne for himself, which is so deeply insane and unpopular that it's hardly any time at all before the Tudors are able to depose him and take control themselves. You know, as somebody who didn't know a lot about this history, the whole time I was reading this book, I was like, how does any of this lead to the Tudors taking the throne? Like, I cannot find the thread of that making sense. And it's really because through this conflict, all of these men and boys that could have had a claim were killed. The Lancasters took the throne and had 3 kings before they were all gone. The York line had just Edward and kind of his murderous brother for a second, and then they were gone. It's all just so fleeting, and so much was sacrificed for these impermanent changes. Everything gained is so immediately lost. And we're seeing as many common people and noblemen that might have been passionately Lancastrian or Yorkist. There were far, far more who didn't care, who had no strong preference for who actually sat on the throne beyond their own little self-interest. There are a huge amount of people that never got involved in the conflict or hung back until a very clear victor had emerged. For all that it mattered to the people most directly involved, it didn't matter to a lot of people. And I don't know, maybe the story would feel differently if, you know, the English throne had continued on one of the lines of these families. But it just seems like so quickly after this time period, both of those houses are totally gone. It's just like this interesting moment in history of the magic of the kings being a little bit tarnished. You know, we're kind of seeing behind the curtain that they're just ordinary men. You can definitely see thematically what this story could suggest to a writer. So I definitely feel more prepared to historically analyze literature that alludes to this time period. I've been kind of wanting to get into Shakespeare lately. I haven't sat down and read Shakespeare like since I was in school. I've kind of been itching. Maybe I'll go in this direction. And I think it would be an interesting angle to read Game of Thrones in, though I don't know if I want to reread them before George R. R. Martin puts out more books, if he ever will. But yeah, if you want to know the key players, the battles, kind of all the facts, this book is a great place to start. I'm going to take a little break from history for a couple books, but I will come back to that second book about the Wars of the Roses and maybe do a little comparison, so I've heard that one's a little more scandalous. And Weir has a book about Henry VIII and his wives that I'm interested in. But yeah, that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.